going to our last but not least presentation. We have Professor Stephen Matthews, who is a professor in the Hong Kong University and co-director of Childhood Bilingualism Research Center. And his area of expertise is language typology, syntax, and semantics. And he has a wide scope of research interests, a typology of Chinese grammar, Cantonese, Chaozhou, and Minnan dialects. And he has lots of publications, and like this masterpiece has a Cantonese comprehensive grammar. Also, there are very important publication like the Bilingual Child and the Atlas of Language, and many useful grammar and workbook of Cantonese covering basic, intermediate level, and academic work collection of studies in Cantonese linguistics. So, I'll say he is a work of a masterpiece, and he is going to make a presentation on another masterpiece, which with the title "Insights from a Forgotten Masterpiece: Omilia's Grammatical Remarks." Okay, let's join me. Welcome Professor Matthews with a quick round of applause. So.
Thank you, Ken and colleagues, for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here for my last paper before I retire in 2 weeks' time. Yes, sorry, I just updated some things. Thanks so much, Ken. So I want to bring your attention to this book. Like Marjorie Chan, maybe I start by asking how many people are familiar with this book, First Year Cantonese? Not many. Okay, so hopefully this is an audience which will find the topic interesting. If you haven't come across it before, then you can sort of experience it for the first time today. And from the title, it seems to be a very elementary piece of work, right? It seems to be, okay, first year Cantonese for Guilos. It's about it. What can we learn from that, right? If you open the book, you immediately find that it's written by a missionary from the Maryknoll Mission, Catholic Mission in Hong Kong. And that will give you some expectations. Maybe you will expect to learn some Catholic terminology or something, rather than anything of interest to us today. We will also see that as soon as you open the book, you'll be confronted with a lot of Latin terminology, which may be interested to Professor Belassen, but to those of us that didn't grow up with Latin, you'll start to say, what is this? What are we doing here with Latin? Right? Even if you are interested in Latin, then it's obviously quite an outdated work by now. So if I propose to you that you should be using it to teach Cantonese, you're going to be shaking your head and laughing at the outdated language. The editions that I will talk about range from 1938 to 1966, so they're all more or less out of date. And so this is what I've just discussed is the way that I looked at first year Cantonese when I first came across it, which means that I basically ignored it. Okay, that's that. Okay, set it aside, put it back in the library, put it back on the shelf. And indeed, its status today is that it is basically ignored, except as an interesting source of early Cantonese data, like from the first half of the 20th century. And Samuel Zheng Honglin has sort of mined this book for examples of grammatical change since the 1930s. What I want to propose today is that this is, in fact, an early pedagogical grammar of Cantonese, and as such, repays looking at carefully, especially if you are teaching or studying Cantonese. Okay. So who is this author? Thomas Omelia lived from 1898 to 1973. He was a Catholic missionary in Guangdong and later in Hong Kong. He was the last of a series of missionaries to have contributed to the study of Cantonese. And in that role, he appears briefly in Shin Kataoka and Cream Lee's book on missionary contributions to the study of Cantonese. His reputation, even among the missionaries, his reputation is very much to be the language teacher of the Catholic missions in this area. And he's best known as the author of first-year Cantonese and of one or two other teaching materials, such as teaching Chinese script to foreigners. Might be of interest to Professor Balasan, that one. Dig that out for another talk, another time. Today, I will only talk about the first-year Cantonese. It is a sort of short biography of Thomas Omelia. You may recognize the kind of surname beginning with O is what? It's an Irish name, so from Ireland. And he's not exactly an Irishman, but he was born into an Irish family with that name in Bradford in Yorkshire, England, and soon moved with his family to Philadelphia in the US. Trained as a missionary, Catholic, so most of the Irish traditionally Catholic background, was trained as a missionary, inspired to join the mission to South China, and found himself in 1923 stationed at Yanjiang, and then Sanchen Island in the Jiangmen district, on an island which was a Portuguese settlement and then a Catholic mission station. He came to Hong Kong in 1934, joining the new Maryknoll House, Maryknoll Father's house, which was a sort of center for training and recuperation of missionaries, and ran language classes, for which he developed his materials and the book First Year Cantonese. He managed to get out of Stanley during the war, not quite sure how, but he did, and returned to Stanley in 1959, found that he needed to update his book, and this is his revised edition, First Year Cantonese, and eventually sort of retired went to serve with Chinese missions in the US for most of the rest of his life. So here he is on the right. Another picture from his early years in 1924 at Haiyan in Guangdong. And there's an interesting comment about this picture. His colleague, Father O'Donnell, another Irish Catholic missionary, comments, "I can't understand his language, but there's no mistaking his smile." I'm not quite sure what it means about the language. It just occurred to me that Omelia, was having to learn Cantonese at exactly the same age that I did, namely age 25. There's some interesting implications in terms of adult second language acquisition. A bit too late in my case, but what about his case? So what does this mean? Does it mean that he was still struggling? This is 1 year after he arrived. Was he struggling with Cantonese so much that people couldn't understand his Cantonese, or does it mean that he was so fluent already in his Cantonese that ordinary Guelos couldn't follow him? I like to think it's the latter, but I haven't been able to determine what exactly he meant. But there's another interesting comment. There's no mistaking his smile even in an old black and white picture like this. You can see his smile, so it seems that he had some of the likable characteristics that Irish people are famous for. His book, First Year Cantonese, had quite an impact, as you can see from this report in 1940, that the Hong Kong government quickly adopted the first edition of this book as the official textbook for all government officers in Hong Kong whose knowledge required knowledge of Cantonese, such as civil servants, policemen, and so on. And then the chronicles mention this is high praise, particularly given the very many books on the market whose authors claim new and miraculous gimmicks to help beginners learn the very difficult Cantonese language. It was 1940. It seems to be that there's some relevance even today, right? The musical approach to Cantonese, or the how to succeed where thousands have failed kind of books and booklets that come out. 20 years later, after the war, the same chronicles record that his Cantonese textbooks have been so popular that it's going to be time to update his masterpiece. And this is gave me my title for today. As Ken mentioned, it was regarded as a masterpiece, so it'd be a shame if we forgot about it entirely. And in order to produce the revised edition, he was relieved of administrative duties so he could focus on his research. So this came out in 1966. There are various editions, so some of them are not showing up here, but one of the ones that's not showing up on the slide is this one, the revised edition, 1966. I'll be talking mostly about the original book from 1938 and 1941, which you see here. So here it is, if you open it, what you see, the frontispiece from Maryknoll House, the missionary center in Stanley, Chekchu. And in the contents, you can see a very traditional grammatical organization of the lessons, right? So it starts with subject and predicate, pronouns, negative, indirect object, the genitive, the possessive case, and so on. So this is mostly Japanese, not where to get Japanese from, mostly Latin vocabulary coming in here. In between, he produced an expanded edition in which he added a bunch of teaching materials. So if you're a teacher, you may want to borrow this one from the library, the third edition from 1953, which begins with the grammar course that we just looked at. And then it continues with part 2, ditties and easy pieces. Ditties is something like a trivial song, a short song or a rhyme or a not very serious poem, which he was using as a language practice. Then there are some longer conversations or dialogues such as the Sampanrai, boys will be boys, and the education of girls. And part 4 consists of what he calls random notes and random idioms and notes, which is basically a glossary of Cantonese terms with some interesting notes. I think that it would, I've never seen anybody discuss this glossary at all. Maybe it would repay, could be another paper or little study or a thesis on its own right. But I won't look at it today. Just an example of his piece from The Education of Girls. So in Hong Kong, Maryknoll is most famous for starting girls' schools, right? So my wife was from one of the Maryknoll convent schools. So education of girls was a priority for the Maryknoll mission. And this is one of his, seems to be one of his graduation speeches that he gave. He said, and here is a picture which Emily actually took himself in Yangjiang in 1934 of his graduating class. So all of this went into his teaching materials. I want to focus on what he calls grammatical remarks. And the interest of these was recently pointed out by Luisa Patenico, one of the new Italian scholars in sinology that Professor Belason mentioned yesterday. And she's particularly interested in Cantonese. And she picks up on the interest of the grammatical remarks in the textbook. And she points out that it looks old-fashioned, but it's not just old-fashioned, actually revealing in some ways. So O'Malley clearly takes it for granted that Cantonese has grammar, right? And it's not so obvious in the 1930s or 40s. In fact, when I first started, I think I must have told somebody I was working on a grammar of Cantonese, and one of my students famously said, "Mak Cantonese your grammar, game?" Seems a silly question now, but in the 1990s, I got that reaction both from students and from others. And O'Malley clearly takes it for granted that Cantonese has grammar and goes on to tell you how it works, right? But then it recognizes the work as in some ways, well, actually it makes 2 points here. So far understanding of the peculiarities of a language, and that's what I want to try to share with you today, and also pave the path for modern descriptions of Cantonese. Yes, I think so, although one of the reasons I'm giving this talk is this kind of apology for not taking O'Malley more seriously than I did. So when Yip and I were working on the grammar, we really should have paid more attention to it than we did. Okay. What we will see right away, we already saw in the contents that there is a lot of Latin terminology going on, right? And at one point, I remember being taught that, oh, the missionaries applied Latin grammar to languages all over the world, and they got it completely wrong, right? A completely misguided attempt to describe other languages using Latin or Greek grammar. So we have this kind of prejudice. This is one example of using the Latin model. He's distinguishing the genitive from the partitive. Now, the genitive is the name of the possessor case in Latin, right? And he's basically pointing out here that we have two different things in English that look the same. The taste of water is a true genitive relationship, whereas a cup of water is not a genitive relationship, it's a partitive relationship. And in French, that'll be quite a different thing. And he's going to explain in Cantonese, it's a quite different thing as well. So here the problem is that English is misleading or English is ambiguous, and we have to split these two functions and treat them differently. Because I don't think anybody studied Latin here except for Professor Balasen, so just try to explain briefly what case is in Latin, because this is, I think Professor Balasen said he spent 7 years studying Latin? Me too, something like this. Right? So we spent a lot of time studying the cases and their functions. So here's a very, very simplified version. A case, such as genitive or nominative, is a form of a word, the form of a noun or substantive, with a particular ending indicating its grammatical function in a sentence. So if we take the word water, as we were just talking about, then we have the nominative form aqua, which means water, as the subject of a sentence. Then we have accusative form aquam, in which the nasal ending indicates that accusative case, and this is the object of the sentence. And if we're going to do a genitive, something of water, the taste of water, for example, it will be aquae. The aqua becomes a diphthong I, and this indicates, well, indicates various things actually, but it could indicate the genitive form, right? So why are we using this for Chinese? Well, I think everybody agrees that we don't have morphological case we don't have this kind of case in Chinese, but a lot of other linguists have talked about case in Chinese or case relationships or case functions in Chinese according to their understanding of those things, of grammatical relations. And a good friend of ours, Audrey Li and Hui, proposed, and it was actually her PhD thesis, is called abstract case in Chinese. Right? So making the case for case, if you like, that it does make sense to talk about noun phrases having case, even if you don't see it. That's what she means. And maybe that's what is a modern version of what O'Malley meant. So here is one of his grammatical remarks in which he starts to talk about the notion nominative, right? So which we just had as a case for the subject of the sentence. And here he's saying that for various reasons, which we'll look at later, any member of the sentence, together with its modifiers, may be placed first. And the remainder of the sentence runs along according to the usual rules. This is a kind of inversion, and we're going to call it the nominative absolute. And you'll soon see that what he's talking about is topicalization, right? In our modern terms, making something the topic of the sentence, except that term didn't exist in the 1930s. So what do? He was struggling to find a description or a language terminology to describe this phenomenon. and he borrows the Latin term nominative. Well, he creates a new term out of two Latin terms, nominative and absolute, and I will try to explain what he's doing there. So what he's talking about is sentences like this. You could say, 你仔我啲書係邊書? So 邊書 is an old way of saying where in Cantonese, right? And so, well, you could say that, but the following is often preferred. 我啲書你仔係邊書? My books, where did you put them, right? So he's pointing out something which Leon Thompson later described as the topic prominent feature, the sense that the second one is just as normal as the first one, or even more natural in some ways, which we'll come to. So why is it calling it the nominative absolute? Well, the nominative case in Latin is literally the naming form. It's the case form for the subject of a sentence, and it's morphologically unmarked. So it doesn't have an ending added, it doesn't have an inflection. And so a simple example would be puer, meaning boy, is in the subject case. And if the boy loves the girl, then you have boy nominative, girl accusative. Amat loves. It's an SOV language. Well, it's a long story, but it's treated as an SOV language. So the boy is in the nominative case, but it doesn't have an ending, whereas the girl is in the accusative case and does have an ending, the M. Relieved that Professor Blasson is nodding, so I haven't got my Latin wrong. There's just yet. Okay, so why talk about topicalization as nominative? Well, topics are, of course, morphologically unmarked, just like the nominative puer in Latin. You might say that in Matthews and Yip's grammar, you will find that topics could be indicated with le, but interestingly, I haven't been able to find that le, that topicalizing le in Amelia's work. So whether he felt it was too colloquial to be worth bothering with, or whether it didn't really exist at the time, I'm not sure. For all of his examples, there was no kind of topic marker used, right? And secondly, as he said, the nominative absolute is about putting something else first that you don't expect to come first. So it comes first in the sentence, which they do in Latin some of the time, but it's more complicated than that, which is why we spent 7 years learning Latin rather than one. So he's created a term, the nominative absolute, using what we just saw, the nominative, but also the absolute. So what is this? Well, he's thinking of the ablative absolute construction in Latin. Now, when we were, Professor Blasson and I were in school, grammar consisted of accidents, the forms of words, and the constructions. So that the grammar syntax was about constructions, right? So the ways of putting words together. And this is one of the classical constructions, the ablative absolute. And in form, what you see is a past is a noun and a noun phrase and a past participle in the ablative case. Now, the ablative case is a bit tricky because literally ablative means away from, and it can mean that, but because of a historical accident, it can also mean with or by or various or than or various other grammatical relations. So the ablative is a bit of a mixed bag in its functions. But for this purpose, it means with, right? So the ablative absolute construction means with something having happened or after something has happened, right? And classical example of Roman violence, the city having been burnt in the ablative case. So with the city burnt, the Romans withdrew and went and attacked another town or whatever they did. So why is this absolute? Well, the phrase with the city burnt is absolutely is literally cut off, like separated from the rest of the sentence. And it's separated here by a comma. Presumably it would have been separated prosodically in speech, but we don't have the recordings. As one of my Latin teachers says, the recordings have not survived. The tape recordings have not survived. And you could begin to see why he would say this about topicalization in Cantonese, right? Because topics are separated from the rest of the sentence, sometimes orthographically, as his comma here, and typically prosodically. You could do a whole study of that phenomenon. But often there will be some kind of intonation or prosodic break between the topic and the comment, right? So in that respect, it's like the ablative absolute. So we end up with a sentence like 呢啲嘢我就係邊條好呢? Is an old-fashioned feature. So what use is this? Well, if you've been trained in Latin, this actually makes immediate sense, right? If you haven't been trained in Latin, then it's a bit puzzling. But if you think back, rewind to the 1930s, anybody who the Hong Kong government was employing that had to learn Cantonese would in fact have learned Latin. It would have been a prerequisite. So that in my day, you had to have studied Latin a lot in order to just to go to Oxford or Cambridge, which was sort of a prerequisite for these civil service jobs, right? And in effect, it's a long story, but in effect, having been to Oxford or Cambridge was a prerequisite for getting my job, and having studied Latin was a prerequisite for getting into Cambridge. Okay, long story, but that's the fact. So it's actually safe to assume that any missionary coming to Hong Kong and any civil servant working in, well, any European civil servant working in Hong Kong would in fact have had a lot of training in Latin. Interestingly, in the revised version, that was no longer true. So in the 1950s or 60s, policemen coming to Hong Kong sort of may well have, or civil servants might have got into the civil service without any knowledge of Latin. And he tries very hard to sort of scrub the Latin terminology from the revised edition in the 60s. Now, the interesting part, if you like, was just now for emphasis on units, what is the situations in which we use the nominative absolute. And he's quite explicit about this. He's got two, first of all, it mostly applies to objects as a way of topicalizing the object, something that Matthews and Yip also claim. And there were two circumstances in which this will happen. One is when the object is modified by a relative clause, and another is B, when in addition to the object, the sentence has another adverbial phrase following the verb, as in, so the original sentence would be, if that was grammatical, but it's as if you avoid that by doing this. So the first case about the relative clause is this one, and there's an even more explicit description, which I find interesting. It says, if the sentence becomes clumsy or involved, for example, the relative clause modifies the object of the main verb, Chinese prefers to use the nominative absolute for topicalization. For example, if you want to say he would very much like to buy the house you are building, theoretically, this would be he would very much like to buy, you are building that house. But in fact, such a clause is more commonly transposed. So instead, you get the house you are building, he would very much like to buy. It's a nice example. Among other things, it's very Hong Kong because you haven't finished the house and somebody already wants to buy it. It's a case of 買樓花, but also it's a fairly clear explanation for why, well, it doesn't quite say why, for the situation in which you would use this topicalization of the object. He actually said it was preferred in this was more commonly transposed, and I sort of share his intuition. So I've switched to Ping for modern examples, and this is what my wife used to say to me a lot. I'm surprised she didn't say it yesterday. In fact, what she said yesterday, she seemed to assume that it needed no preparation. I'm not quite sure why she thought that. But many times she has said to me, and as far as I can remember, she has never said to me, right? So this is the SVO sentence, and this is the OSV topicalized sentence, and she always uses the first one. Why? Is it preferred? well, I tried asking students, do you prefer? And they all said, no, they're both equally fine. They're the same, right? So the generations of students have told me it's the same, right? So we have a bit of a puzzle. Then I tried another tack. I said, okay, let's look in corpora. Let's look in text to see if this is preferred. Is this more common? Literally, he said more commonly. I'd say, is the first one, more topicalized version, more common than the second? And I failed to show this, but for methodological reasons, I created a corpus of Cantonese, but it wasn't big enough, right? So if you look for relative clauses in corpora, maybe you've done this, you have two problems. One, that they are not common enough. They don't occur very often. In fact, so when I did it with my corpus, I found one beautiful example of something like my wife already said, one beautiful example of what I was looking for, but obviously that wasn't enough to get a sample to test whether there was a preference for one or the other. The other problem I had is that I sent a research assistant away to find me the relative clauses in the text, and she came back with a very long piece of paper saying, is this a relative clause? Is this a relative clause? Is this a relative clause? And I started to get headaches about what wasn't a relative clause. So that actually eventually led to another paper that Virginia wrote about, and I wrote about noun modifying clauses in Cantonese that don't exactly fit the definition of relative clauses, but they're kind of like relative clauses, kind of not. So it's hard to decide what is and what isn't, and they aren't common enough to test this with existing corpora. So that may change. If anybody thinks they've got enough corpora to test this, I'd be fascinated to hear the result. So then I changed tack again and asked a student to do an experiment, because we had cognitive science students that like to do experiments for a while, right? So Yung Ying was one of these cognitive science students that like to do experiments. So we said, well, let's do an experiment. We're going to compare the SVO sentence with an OSV topicalized sentence and see if one is easier or faster to process than the other. So with a simple sentence like this, with a short object, the medicine, it was equally easy or equally fast to read the sentences or the sentence with the topicalized version. They were the same. But here's the interesting part. If we follow Amelia's principle and we put a relative clause before the object to modify it, and you get something like again, you can say that's fine, but it takes longer to read than the topicalized version. The topicalized version, even for me, I can read it faster. And in the experiment, the Cantonese speakers read this significantly faster than the original one. So, so Amelia was right, but it was quite difficult to prove, right? Why is it right? Well, one of my teachers, John Hawkins, developed a theory of the relationship between word orders and processing efficiency. And trying to cut a long story short, his theory predicts Amelia's generalization, right? Why? Well, the problem with the remember, he described these sentences as clumsy or involved. So what is the problem with the sentence? Well, simplifying slightly, it's that the object is a long way from the verb sick. Right? And in an extreme case, you could imagine sort of forgetting what the verb was that the object is going to be the object of. And in the Hawkins theory, there was a thing called a recognition domain, which is basically the amount of words or syllables you have to process or hold in a buffer in order to recognize the verb phrase. And that means you have to put the verb eat together with the object medicine, right? You have to put those things together. And in the other version, now the y and the sick are almost next to each other. I mean, they're not because they're inverted, but they're much closer to each other in this version. And so you get a much shorter recognition domain for the object and verb. This again, I would argue, proves that Amelia was right in the first place, because he says the sentence becomes clumsy or involved when the relative clause modifies the object and the verb, and that's exactly what's going on here. And it becomes clumsy and involved because you have to wait a long time to actually get the object of the verb. So his Latin concept actually led him to sort of quite not about deep, but somewhat penetrating insights into the language. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Now he has another story to tell. That was just one of the reasons for using the nominative absolute. Another one, he says, is when, in addition to the object, the sentence has another adverbial phrase following the verb, such as the place to which, as in 你的我在冰球红你. So what's going on here? Well, again, we could have the original version. 你在我的书海边去. Now, this one is perfectly possible in Cantonese, but if you try it in Mandarin, what do you get? 你放了我的东西在哪里呢? Right, which probably as language teachers, you tell people to avoid. Right, I tell people that in that case, you need to use a 八字句 or some other strategy to avoid that, right? And so this seems to be what he's recognizing. So even though this is possible in Cantonese, so there was an interesting difference here between Cantonese and Mandarin. Even though it's quite grammatical in Cantonese, this one he's saying is preferred. And this relates to what became known as the post-verbal constraint. The idea that a verb can only be followed by one complement, technically a XP complement of the. And this, I think it was named by Timothy Light, another almost a missionary, scholar of religion and a scholar of Cantonese, Timothy Light, interesting character. And it was picked up by Audrey Lee and Win Sibasma and Jim Huang and many other linguists. And it's an interesting puzzle, this. Anybody work on the post-verbal constraint? No. Syntacticians are not here today. Never mind. Have you come across this idea, the post-verbal constraint? Well, I'm sure you have in your teaching. It's just that you don't, maybe you don't call it that, or you call it something else. And of course, it's not exactly true, because this is already a counterexample, so it's not exactly true. But it's something like an optimality constraint, if you know that approach, that it's like a principle. Ideal, so it's as if in Chinese thinking, ideally a verb can only have one complement following it, right? And then there were lots of exceptions and footnotes to be written, but there was some kind of pressure to avoid the two complements to the same verb. And again, this is one of the functions of topicalization, or the nominative absolute, which Amelia spotted correctly. Another thing he spotted in this context was if the combination of object and place to which goes in the same sentence, it's instinctive. That's interesting. He's an intuition that naturally we do this. To transpose the object is another term that he uses for topicalizing the object, fronting the object, dison, and to employ double verbs. So instead of you end up with two verbs together. So these are what he calls double verbs. He talks about this again here. It's natural in Chinese to use two verbs. The main verb governs the object, while the auxiliary helps out with the idea of direction, but he's sort of clear that they're both verbs. And these are what we now think of as serial verbs, right? So he tackles this problem. And before, serial verbs, I think, were discovered by linguists in Africa, and maybe around the 1950s, so much too late for Amelia. So he had to find a way of talking about this phenomenon. And he said, well, it's similar to is similar to saying, pick up a book and come here. Similarly, he went in and sat down, and then he said, well, ta could be considered a purpose infinitive, but then he seems to realize that that doesn't make sense, because we don't have infinitives. So it's as if he's using the Latin grammar and immediately realizing that it doesn't work, right? So, and then he says, well, more precisely, it would be more insightful to say, rather than say, actually, there's another long story here in that do we have infinitive? Do we have finite and non-finite verbs in Chinese? There's a big debate continuing about that. So it's not a crazy idea. A bit like the abstract case thing. That it's not crazy to say you have Chinese case because Audrey and others propose that you do, and serious people. I think they're wrong, but serious linguists continue to propose that you have a distinction of finite. Do you have finite verbs in Chinese? We can argue about that later if anybody wants. Anyway, so he scraps the idea of a purpose infinitive and says, no, what we have here is a single subject with a compound predicate. Is a compound predicate, that is actually very similar to the way that Eichenwald recently described a serial verb construction, namely a sequence of verbs which act together as a single predicate. Interestingly, he notes labels are not important, and if you study serial verbs, that becomes a bit amusing because linguists continue to argue, that's not a serial verb, this is a serial verb, it's not a serial verb. They have this, even in Chinese, well, particularly in Chinese. So Valtrad Powell keeps arguing with people about this, what is and is what is not a serial verb. But maybe he was right the first time. The labels, no, in other words, whether something is a serial verb or not is purely a matter of terminology, is what he's saying. You can decide to define serial verb in this way, and then it is a serial verb. It's not a matter of truth, it's just a matter of terminology. And you know what? I think he's right. I went through years of trying to decide what's a serial verb and not, and I think he was right the first time. One more point about the nominative absolute and topicalization. This is a little tricky because we have to read between the lines and we have to imagine how he actually taught with this textbook. But in the lesson on the nominative absolute, he has this dialogue. And the answer is 我領佢俾人行, etc. 然後唔喺書，我就領返嚟。So what are the, well, first of all, it starts with the nominative absolute. 嗰啲嘢 is the topicalized object of leng, right? But then it continues with 我領係俾人行，我就領返嚟。So what's going on here is that the object is missing, right? And the object of leng is continues to be the topic which was set in the first place. Now, I'm fairly convinced that that's what he meant. He doesn't explicitly say so, and I think that's because he didn't have the vocabulary to do so. So today we would say that we have null objects co-referential with the topicalized, with the fronted topic. So we would analyze it like this, and the gap after leng is the null object, and then we have lots of syntactic theories about what that is, what that might be. This is Audrey Lee again. But what this dialogue shows is that once you stated the topic, it continues to be the topic, and you can leave out subjects and leave out objects because they refer back to that topic. And one of my colleagues, actually your former colleague here, Xu Dingxu, anybody remember Xu Dingxu? Before he retired, but I'm not sure he did retire. He just moved to Guangzhou and kept going, right? And he wrote very interesting analyses of these things and introduced a notion of topic chain, that is a series of missing or null subjects and objects, all referring back to the original sentence topic. So this is, I think, is I would have loved to attend Amelia's lesson on this to see what he said about it. But it seems to me that he'd recognized this point, although he doesn't try to describe it, because I don't think he quite had the grammatical vocabulary to do so. So in sum, it seems to me this is a very insightful delving into topicalization. What he called the nominative absolute topicalization was a feature of Cantonese, a distinctive feature often preferred. It relates to the idea of a topic prominent language. The topicalized version of a sentence may be preferable in some way to the canonical or the SVO version of it. And he spelled out exactly in which cases with heavy objects. And now we can say, well, why is it clumsy? Well, because it involves an extended processing domain, which you can shorten by topicalizing the object. And with the adverbial phrase after the verb, by by applying the topicalization, you respect the postverbal constraint, whatever that is, right? And finally, I think what he just demonstrated is that the topicalization underlies the null objects in discourse, even though he didn't quite have the vocabulary to express that. So your teachers, what about the pedagogy? The pedagogy is implicit, really, but there's an interesting point in the preface by the bishop of the time, James Walsh, where he says the method used in this book is apperception. I had to look up what apperception was because it's a sort of defunct term in psychology, rather, but in psychology of learning, apperception, well, it's still in the APA Dictionary of Psychology, meaning the mental process by which a perception or an idea is assimilated into an individual's existing knowledge. So what he was doing with Latin grammar was a good example of this, right? So with facing all of these strange properties of topicalization or inversion in Chinese, a new to the learner, a new type of sentence structure is first brought to the attention of the learner, and secondly assimilated to a familiar one, which we spent years studying in high school, namely a Latin construction with some of the same properties. In the revised edition 1966, there were a number of changes. I mentioned that he scrapped the Latin. He spent about 10 years in the US after the war, and you can see that he was influenced by structural linguistics, which was booming in the US at the time, and behaviorist psychology. How do we know that? Well, because he put in structure drills. So as language teachers, you may have you heard about the grammar translation method and then the drill and kill method, the drilling method. So he added drills in the revised edition because that was the done thing in language teaching in the 50s and 60s. Sadly, the grammatical remarks disappear, right, as if they've gone out of fashion. Actually, they're still reformulated in some way, but they're called analysis instead of grammatical remarks. He tries to get rid of the Latin terms, and he adds structural drills. So here's one of the structural drills. You get drilling the possessive construction with ge. So and this is a nice example. I mean, is that first year Cantonese? It seems to me a bit advanced for first year Cantonese to me. But anyway, this is drilling the properties of ge. One of the analysis, so here he tells you how to create a relative clause. I don't know if anybody does this or if you find this insightful, but I can imagine that for a certain type of learner, this might be helpful. It's like a 1, 2, 3 instruction for how to create a relative clause in Chinese, right? Put the relative clause in front of the pronoun, so you get who live in glasses people. Drop the relative pronoun because it doesn't exist, so then you get living glass houses people, and then to compensate for dropping the relative pronoun who, you insert a demonstrative like this or that, and then you get living glass houses those people, and then you plug in the Cantonese words and voila. So this is a piece of his pedagogy. You can formulate your sentence in that way if it works for you. The language I mentioned has been mined for its early Cantonese syntax. So in the original books, you have a kind of alternation or a variation between "你有天冇呢" and "你有冇錢呢", with the second version basically being the modern structure. So these things were used alongside each other. So this is, if you like, a transitional phase, because I think if you go back to, was it Widgeman, 1841, then you will basically find the first one and not the second one. So there's a change going on here, which Zheng Honglin describes. It was not a new article, but there was a new book here by Zheng Honglin, if you haven't noticed, quite a nice book which he collects various studies of Cantonese. And there's a Chinese version, you can read it in Chinese. You can buy it at the Chinese bookstore. what did I mention? Oh, I mentioned that because there are hardly any bookstores left in Hong Kong, so you have to go to Chinese U to buy them. You know, Hong Kong U is now a university without a bookstore. I mean, what do they think? Yeah, okay, you can see here what generation I belong to. What were we talking about? Yes, so the language is transitional in this respect. It has both of these question constructions. The questions very regularly use end in ni, and this is a nice example of how particle usage changes quite rapidly in Cantonese. So it doesn't exist anymore. In the revised version, you still have the pre-war syntax, as in still exists. But the ni has changed to net in 20 years, apparently. So we could actually, you could do a thesis or a master's thesis, if you like, looking at the changes from the 1930s to the 1960s edition. Another example of the same thing, the Songfa Guango. I remember sort of reading about this and finding it very puzzling, because by the time I arrived in Hong Kong in 1990, nobody used this at all. I could find nobody that could like admit to using it. Nobody would ever use this, right? But in the 1960s, you had both the Songfa Guango and Songfa Beine, both of those constructions side by side. Is this any of use to language teachers? I just raised the question. I honestly don't know. But if you find what I said interesting, you could consider creating a lesson plan based on Amelia. You could take the dialogue, update it where necessary. So, and some of them, to me, could be on the street today. There are some of the dialogues that like even the one that I said about the one seems like you could borrow it just as it is. You would want to update the romanization, because this one is not terribly nice as far as tone marking, as you may have noticed. He didn't invent it, he borrowed it from Maya Wemper. You could base a lesson on one of his lessons and see how it works, if you like. Of course, you would have to put it into PowerPoint and you'd have to modernize it. So I've been hearing about adding GPT, adding augmented reality, virtual reality, all the novel things, innovative things going on in your teaching today. So what I tried to show is that we were wrong when we thought that it was an elementary, misguided missionary work. It was actually, I argue, an early pedagogical grammar of Cantonese, quite insightful to quite a high level of detail into how Cantonese works, and in some cases, what he spotted are things that the linguists are still arguing about exactly how that works today. So it's not like, oh, he didn't understand anything, we understand it today. On the contrary, in some cases, you could wonder how much we've moved on today, how much more do we understand today than he did, other than terminology or formalization. The Latin model, so we started off thinking, well, maybe it's just a mistake, big mistake that the missionaries kept making to apply the Latin model. Not really, right? So the Latin model was quite insightful, as it turned out, and particularly if you have learners, as he did, that were trained in Latin, it would have made sense. So for all of these reasons, I suggest that any edition of the work would repay reading. If you're learning Cantonese or studying or teaching Cantonese, I predict that you will learn something. You can tell me. While this is a very old-fashioned way of ending the talk, but it seemed appropriate to an old-fashioned talk like this. Oh, I want to apologize for the fact that all the pictures are black and white. My wife wanted more color, but this is the 1930s, so all we have is black and white pictures. So here we have Amelia with his dog eating off his table. And he started his book by saying, learning to speak Chinese gracefully and fluently is no sinecure. I mean, it's not an easy job, yet it is not as impossible as has often been asserted. So I want to thank our one colleague, Umberto Ansaldo, who worked with me on missionary grammars, and we had some interesting discussions. And special thanks to colleagues who worked so hard to organize this event, to Ken Cheng. Ken, he even had to fetch me from the entrance this morning. Sarah, thank you for the invitation. David, thank you for your advice. And thank you for all of the committee. There's a lot of people involved. I have some idea of what's involved in a hybrid conference, and you've done it beautifully. So thank you very much.
Yeah, that's great. Right? It's we that we should thank you for this wonderful, interesting talk. We travel through history, and yeah, there was a missing masterpiece. Right? I may consider using this, adopt this to our Cantonese classes to see how it works. And maybe we may take a few minutes if there are some questions online, offline, for Professor Matthews. Any questions? Maybe I just express some thinking I've got from this talk. I just found that the same grammatical phenomenon, actually we can view it in different, we can frame it in different model. I used just learn about something. It's called topicalization. In my concept, there's only one thing. If you do this, 呢本書你放喺邊度啊? This is topicalization. No, nothing else. But today I learned if you use another framework, the Latin model, it is something called nominative absolute. So it makes me think that actually the Cantonese grammar syntax we are learning, is it we are framed under the English syntax, or sometimes framed under the Mandarin syntax? Maybe, maybe someday we can look through the Cantonese grammar in another perspective, or in a unique Cantonese way to look at our own grammar. I don't know. There's not a question in this, some kind of inspiration I get from your talk. Yeah, so just some kind of nonsense. Any last question? Quick question, any? No, if not, I'd like invite you to end with a big round of applause to Professor Matthews, because he said this is the last keynote speech before his retirement. So